I've marked out roughly on all the pieces of wood here where I want to get all the pieces for the bookcase. For the top, I've got some quarter sawn material, and that'll also be used on the side panels. For the legs, I've got some rift sawn pieces. On one of the rift sawn pieces, the grain falls off to the side a little bit, so it becomes a bit more flat sawn, so that can be used for some of the shorter stretches. And doing it this way allows me to avoid some of the flaws in the wood. Like there's a big knot here, there's one on the side, there's a little bit of shake in one end, which I can avoid quite easily now that I've spent the time looking for all of that. The initial breakdown of material occurs both at the miter saw and at the bandsaw. Having small parts to deal with makes it a lot easier to get better results when jointing and dimensioning material, either because of the shorter bed on my machine or just the reduced weight and leverage smaller pieces have. With a heavy-duty rip blade installed, the large board can be turned into legs. Note the rift sawn grain for the same appearances on all faces. I ripped the legs a little heavy so that I could get a nicer finish on all four sides using the thicknesser. A DRO can ensure you're hitting the exact mark that you want, and super fun bonus fact, this is the last time I used that DRO because it died immediately afterwards and refused to keep any settings. The same process is repeated for all of the stretcher pieces. These are all 40 by 20 millimeters, varying only in length. One of the downsides of this heavy-duty rip blade is that it doesn't leave the cleanest finish. The top has been milled, but the bottom piece still has the cut marks on it from the blade. The culprit is these horror movie sized teeth. Keep that in mind when ripping. Leaving things just a hair wide means that you've got room to clean up the surface on other machines. With everything ripped to size, it can be cut to final length at the table saw using a crosscut sled and a stop on the fence. As per usual, you shouldn't have the workpiece touching the fence while cross-cutting, however the use of a short stop prevents the offcut from binding. For the shorter pieces, the crosscut sled is just long enough to use its own stop. My table saw only handles about 900mm crosscut, so for the much longer length of the legs, marks on the legs are all that's needed. A quick grip clamp holds it to the crosscut sled, and the zero clearance plate provides a good reference for where the blade is going to be. Just like with the mission style side tables, I mark the legs on the end grain to help with the orientation. There is FL and FR for front left and right, S for short side and L for long side. For all the joinery in this project, again I'm going to be using the Festool domino for loose mortise and tenon. Now if you don't have a domino, don't worry, there is nothing in this project that can't be done with a normal mortise and tenon. And on that note, I'm in the process of making a series on how to make mortise and tenons using a variety of different power tools. I won't go into the hand tool methods, that's not really my stick here. I've already gone on location to Timbercon to use some of their tools to show off different methods that I don't have access to because I don't have those tools, but I'll be shooting a whole bunch in my workshop as well. So stay tuned, that series will be released sometime before the next major project after this one. MDF clamped to my workbench acts as a great end stop for the shorter apron pieces. The legs receive either 2 or 3 mortises per face, depending on if they're in the front or in the back. The domino fence is lowered for the back aprons. They'll sit flush with the back of the legs rather than having an inset. All other spacing remains the same. The top is relatively skinny at 20mm, so it can be easily resawn. In a bit of a rarity for me, I did actually use dominoes for alignment for the panel. Biscuits work just as well and are cheaper for this application. It can really help keep panels flatter when gluing up, however that won't stop warping if the pieces aren't properly dried, as I found out. The side panels are 7mm thin boards that need to be glued up, so resawing the process is jointing, resawing, cleaning up that face at the thicknesser, then resawing again. This keeps at least one edge and one face square on each piece. The thin boards get one edge cleaned up with the table saw, and if there are still any joining issues, they can be stuck in a vise and cleaned up with a hand plane. I've got a dry fit of the bookcase so far. Now I can mark out where I want the panels. The panels have only been resawn at this stage, they haven't been glued together or taken to final dimension. The final dimension is going to be dictated by the router bit we've got. In this case, these panels are a hair over 7mm, so I can use a 1/4 inch bit or 6.35mm bit to make the groove. Then I can size the panel to that groove rather than the other way around. That way I'll get a cleaner result all the way around. I don't use my drum sander all that often, but for some tasks it is very much the perfect tool. I need to clean up these panels and get them to fit in the rail pieces, currently just a little bit oversized. Now I could use the thicknesser, and that is a great tool in most applications, but in this particular application, the 1/4 sawn grain on these panels has a real tendency to tear out, and I don't know if you can quite see this, but it is incredibly fuzzy compared to the board that I have sanded. Now do remember, with these drum sanders, they're not actually thickness sanders. Yes, you can size something, dimension something with it, but it's not like a wide belt sander. You really need to take very small increments when you're surfacing the material. I think the recommended for this is somewhere like 1/4mm to 1/2mm per pass, otherwise you will run the risk of bogging down the motor and tripping the thermal overload. Now again, this isn't a required tool, but it is a nice tool for the task. You can absolutely do it with a thicknesser, but you do need to pay special attention to the grain direction so that you don't tear it out. It's a little bit tricky to get everything in shot, but this is a dry fit and everything is looking pretty good. So the panels fit into the frames really well. They still need finish preparation, so full sanding up to 220 grit, and the panels will be, actually the whole lot will be pre-finished before assembly. The reason for pre-finishing is it's a lot easier, but particularly in panels where they'll expand and contract, you don't want to have finished it after the fact, have it contract and expose unfinished areas of the wood. In the back here, where there is no panel currently, it will receive a rebate around the frame section of it, which will then in turn have shiplap panels go in there. The boards for the shiplap panels were processed the exact same way as the boards for the side panels, in that they started as a thicker board, they were resawn, surfaced, and so on. These ended up being a little bit thicker at about 7.5mm. When I was making the initial cuts for the side panels, I actually made a few mistakes. I had the fence set incorrectly, and I ended up using a little bit more material than I actually wanted to. And the flow-on effect for that is I used up the last of the material I had for the back panel. So I'm gonna have to alternate in some other material. So these boards aren't quite as wide, so that's why you'll see a combination of wide boards and narrower boards, but these will be nailed on rather than glued on. So Worst case, if I don't like it, I can always take it off and replace it. We're over here at the router table to route in the shiplap or the half lap on either side, alternating sides of the panels. The reason I like to use the router table is I can use some nice vertically mounted feather boards which help press the workpiece down. In the case of thin boards, they do have a tendency to raise up slightly because of the cutter, or they may even just have small curls and warping and all of that going on, particularly at the moment it is very humid where I am. I'll be using a 1/2 inch cutter. It happens to be a spiral upcut bit because my other cutters are too long that I can't lower them low enough. You could do this with the dado stack, but it is going to be a little bit more difficult if you don't have those vertical feather boards applying that extra bit of pressure. So the shiplap panels are all cut to length, they all have their rebate on them, but the actual size I'm not 100% sure on. So I've reassembled the dry fit of the cabinet and I can take a measurement from the back rebate, including the actual rebate dimensions, but the panels laid out how they will go, and I've put in these wonderful spaces. These are 2mm spaces. I have a big bucket of spaces, highly recommend getting them, so that I can sort of preload it with a little bit of expansion and contraction. If they were all butted up against each other and there was no room in case these do expand, well, there's then no point of having them shiplapped in the first place. They'll cause issues. So the idea with this is that I've got a known spacing, so I can take the measurement from the back panel, compare it with this new measurement including the spaces, and then take off half that amount on either of the two end pieces. So in this case, it's about 500mm opening. This is about 550mm, so I need to take 25mm or about 1 inch off either of the end two, and that'll work just fine. No joinery will need to be recut. Just about to do the glue up, got my glue out, got my brush out, and then I realised I actually haven't accounted for any of the shelves. We'll be going for the sawtooth mechanism that I did a few weeks ago, but I actually haven't made the standards for this just yet. So with that in mind, I need to do something so that I can still get on with the glue up, but be able to add those standards in. The standards will fit in just behind the groove for the panels on the short side, so there'll be 8 of those, 2 per side, or 2 per leg I should say. That way it's broken up, it's a little bit easier to machine as well. To attach those, since this is pre-finished, I could either scrape off the finish, I could route in a channel dado, slot it in, but what I'm going to go for is 5mm dominoes. You could obviously use dowels in this situation, or if you haven't pre-finished it, just glue it straight on. The wedging action of the bridge pieces will stop it from actually falling out, or worst case, I can always scrape off the finish and glue it on at a later point. While the glue dried, I could work on the vertical Sawtooth Stiles. They only need to be about 15mm, so ripping some thicker stock was needed. This can get ganged up all at once to be drilled. The drill hole pattern matches the jig I made for the Sawtooth patterns a few weeks ago. These are all flush up against the drill press fence, so the varying overhang doesn't really matter. To speed up the process, the vertical rough cuts are made using the crosscut sled. The majority of the waste is removed at the bandsaw, being careful not to go over the lines. Then it's just a matter of using the sled and pattern at the router table to get everything flush and trimmed up. The bridge pieces are cut at the same angle, 18 degrees, as the standards. A miter gauge and reference stop on the fence is all that's needed here. You might be wondering why the notches in the bridge pieces rather than, well, not having notches. The reason for the notches is it provides another way to interlock the actual shelf piece. Now, you can certainly have the shelf, if it's a wide shelf, just sitting straight on top of the bridge, no problem whatsoever. However, what we've found is that having some strips of wood is more economical in terms of material costs, but mostly makes it really easy to adjust. Having to angle a wide, longish shelf in and out is a little bit annoying, and we do actually adjust our game storage shelves relatively frequently as games go in and out of favour and as we get new games. The notch isn't necessary. It doesn't necessitate having a couple of strips, though that's what I'm going for. You can certainly join them together, or perhaps you want to have a glass shelf and this would be a good border piece, or perhaps you want to have a mesh wire or something like that. Either way, the bridge pieces do give you a fair bit of flexibility, whether you notch them, don't notch them, or do something else. Perhaps some dowels sticking up to create a positive lock on the actual shelf piece. As you can see, I've got the cabinet backside up on the workbench, and I'm putting in these Shiplap panels. The panels just go one on top of another. The Shiplap helps hold everything into position, but to make sure everything's locked in, we need to put a couple of tacks in. There's still going to be enough room between each of the panels for expansion and contraction, even though the end two will have more nails in them. Otherwise, the in-between ones are just going to have one at the top, one at the bottom. So just like when I measured everything, I'm using these 2mm spacers to get my spacing right. And for whatever reason, I cut these just a hair too short, so I'm just using spacers at the top and the bottom as well. I've got these blued cut tacks, and they're a little bit short. I miscalculated on the length that I needed, but they will do the job because these aren't weight bearing. They just have to hold the piece in, and when everything is tacked in, it's going to hold its neighbour in and so on and so forth, so it should be fine anyway. So the game bookcase thing is done. This is not where it's actually going to live, but we didn't have a wide enough area that I could take photos and videos of it, other than here. It will hold up all of our overflow games and accessories, and quite often it will hold up our cat. I've tested it on heavier games as well, both gameplay wise and actual physical weight, and these shelves, while they might look diminutive, they will hold up Gloomhaven, and even Gloomhaven with the cat sitting on top of the box with next to no sag. Certainly nothing to be concerned about compared to like a particle board shelf or something on much wider span. The key here is that it is quite a shallow span. This hasn't worked out entirely perfect. Top panel has warped slightly. It's very frustrating. It's really due to the crazy humidity we've been having here this summer. It's not the end of the world. I could replace it, and I may very well do that down the track. The top is attached just like the Mission side table tops with Z-clips. I'm not really going to rehash that. I'll do a separate episode talking about different ways to attach tops soon. You might wonder why there isn't a bottom shelf, and that's because every time I've moved this, the cat has hopped in there. We'd initially intended to put a shelf, so we put some cleats on the four sides and either plywood or hardwood panel just dropped on top, held in by gravity. But when the cat has decided the lower shelf is his, this is probably a better idea. We don't have to worry about weight loading and things like that. Then and it means he's not inclined to actually climb the bookcase. So one of the games from our other board game shelving system closer to the board gaming table is Scythe. It's a reasonably heavy game weight-wise, and that will slide onto the shelves just fine. It's behind everything. So a bit of context for how big this is. If you've got other massive games like Twilight Imperium or War of the Ring will fit on here too, just fine. Thanks for watching.